Hello everyone. Today I have decided to make a response to this. Well, as you can see, the title's a bit stupid. Um, this guy obviously knows nothing about Marxism, and yeah, enjoy the video.
Why is it when somebody criticizes socialism, perhaps by pointing out the abysmal record of the Soviet Union on everything from civil liberties to economic conditions to the gulags, you are almost bound to have someone enter the chat and confidently exclaim, "You idiot! That was communism, not socialism."
Well, actually, it was neither. The Soviet Union, for the majority of its existence, actually maintained a capitalist economy. Or, well, state capitalism at least. Definitely not a free market, but certainly capitalist. After all, it maintained commodity production and wage labour, and the accumulation of capital. Although this capital was centralised in the hands of the state, this does not make it not capitalist. After all, it's the social relations that define an economic system. It is not the form it takes. Function, when it comes to economics, is much more important than form. Or, to put it another way, it is what the system does rather than what the system is that is what is important here.
Which is a somewhat fascinating claim, as the USSR did stand for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But then again, simply because someone claims something about themselves or their country doesn't mean that they actually are that thing. I mean, after all, the Democratic Republic of South Korea is not really democratic or a republic. So, just to try to settle this, how about we go straight to Karl Marx himself to see what the potential differences might have been between communism and socialism? Well, according to the Oxford Handbook of Karl Marx,
all the works of Karl Marx in the world, and you choose to pick a book that was not even written by Karl Marx.
Marx used many terms to refer to a post-capitalist society: positive humanism, socialism, communism, realm of free individuality, free association of producers, etc., etc. He used these terms completely interchangeably. The notion that socialism and communism are distinct historical stages is alien to his work and only entered the lexicon of Marxism after his death.
Actually, the general belief held amongst Marxists is not that of socialism, communism, and the proletarian dictatorship being the same thing. Generally held belief amongst most Marxists is that socialism would represent a lower phase of communist society, which would be marked by some form of state ownership and distribution according to labour, hence from each according to his work. In communism, which would be the higher phase, classes, the state, and money are entirely abolished, and distribution is based on need, hence from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, emphasizing the fact that communism distributes goods based on need, whilst people contribute to the society based on how much they are able to.
So, where do we start to begin this distinction between socialism and communism? Well, according to David Steele, it was in 1888. Marxists employed socialism in place of communism, as the latter had come to be considered an old-fashioned synonym for socialism. It was not until after the Bolshevik Revolution that socialism was appropriated by Vladimir Lenin to mean a stage between capitalism and communism. Okay, but
Actually, Marx did acknowledge the existence of a transitionary period. Although he did not call it socialism, he tended to refer to it as the dictatorship of the proletariat. For example, in his critique of the Gotha program, Marx stated, and I quote, between capitalist and communist society, there lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this, there is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. End quote.
Why would he do that? I mean, what was the purpose of manufacturing a distinction between socialism and communism?
Well, you see, that's the thing. The distinction between some sort of transitionary phase and communism, as I stated earlier, was not a new thing created by Lenin. Um, it was more just a change of terms. However, I am not liking how you're trying to think that there's some kind of manufacturing here. It feels like another accusation against socialists and communists of some kind of insidious evil plot. Um, that would honestly be like me saying that the distinction between liberalism and capitalism was manufactured.
If they were already supposed to be so different. Again, according to Steele, it was because he used it to defend the Bolshevik program from Marxist criticism that Russia's productive forces were not sufficiently developed for communism. And now we've got to explain some more things here because that doesn't seem to make sense. Why would the term socialism be redefined as a stage between capitalism and communism for the purpose of defending communism? And maybe it had something to do with this, because what Marx envisioned was a kind of classless utopia, a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Whoa there, cowboy. You are making some very silly assumptions here. A so-called classless utopia, which is something that Marx never even advocated for, since his ideology is based in materialism, uh, is completely antithetical to a dictatorship of the proletariat. You are literally just generalizing terms here without even knowing what they mean. So let me sum it up for you. A dictatorship of the proletariat is one in which the workers exist as the ruling class. It's a state where the workers rule. Whereas a classless utopia, as you quote unquote say it, would mean some kind of futuristic, lofty society where classes don't exist. Of course, classes are capable of not existing. In fact, they have not existed for quite a lot of time in human history. And that is what we communists advocate. And I'm not going to try and discredit my own arguments here. But basically, what you're saying is that a classless society and a society in which the workers are the ruling class is effectively the same thing, where it really, really isn't. Because just because a majority are in charge doesn't mean there's not some kind of class hierarchy.
Where the means of production and really all private property of any significance was owned in common. This did not just mean the destruction of the capitalist system, it meant the destruction of religion, the traditional family, and even the concept of government itself as we know it. But remember how Marx not only used socialism interchangeably with communism, but also the term post-capitalist, because Marxist theory posited that communism would happen as a result of what he believed to be the internal inconsistencies and contradictions of capitalism. It was only then that the workers of the world would unite, seize the means of production, and eventually usher in said communist end states.
Oh, you see, the thing is, the intention of the Russian Revolution, uh, at least in Lenin's view, was actually to kickstart a world revolution, not a revolution just localized in Russia. Because at the same time, the Spartacist revolt and the German Revolution were well underway at this point. Workers were starting uprisings, forming councils of action and the like. And you know, if and you know, Lenin did say that like they were doomed if the German Revolution failed, and that is why we saw such a degeneration of the Soviet Union. It could have only ever become a bourgeois state. It could not have become socialism, and you're trying to assume that Marxists don't actually acknowledge that, but there are plenty of us that do. You know, we know about this stuff, and it's not like assuming that we don't is just practically ignoring everything that Marxists have been saying for like the past century or so.
The problem was, Tsarist Russia wasn't exactly a model of what Marx would have considered to be late stage capitalism. It was more feudal than the capitalist environment Marx thought would be ripe for revolution. This meant that if Lenin attempted to usher in the dictatorship of the proletariat without the corresponding government authority and power necessary to manage the revolution, things probably weren't going to work out well. By redefining socialism, he was creating a kind of intermediate stage whereby the vanguard of the revolution, which was essentially small groups of Bolsheviks dedicated as true believers, would be the ones to seize the power and run things for a time, just until the workers of the world were ready to live in, real communism, the kind that actually doesn't have any government. So you see how that works? We essentially have two definitions of socialism that we're working with. The first is simply the abolition of private ownership of the means of production and the common ownership of all property by the people. So essentially, the same fundamental objective as communism. That's the reason why the terms were so often used interchangeably. Or we have this other definition of socialism, which also means the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production and the common ownership of all property by the state.
There is an issue here. State ownership is in reality not a form of common ownership. It usually comes under control by a small minority of bureaucrats, and that doesn't seem very common to me. I would also like to say that in every example of state ownership we have in both, planned economies like the Soviet Union and more mixed economies like post-war Britain and the United States, uh, all of these kinds of state ownership have had some form of accumulation of capital. Uh, the difference here is not really between private and common ownership, because a few individuals still benefit from it in the end. It's just the individuals are, like, I don't know, the rulers of the state instead of private capitalists. Um, but the thing is, here we still have a form of capital accumulation. This kind of capital accumulation has not been stopped just because the money and the profit flows to the state instead of a private individual. It serves the same function and purpose as private property. In fact, it can be used to protect private property from forces that threaten it, as has been seen in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany.
Who are, of course, serving as the representative of the people, just until they're ready to run everything without the state, which never seems to happen. So here's the question.
As I said previously, that is because these revolutions failed to institute a world revolution, because a world revolution is what is necessary to actually achieve socialism and then progress to communism, because these countries adopted policies of, for example, in Stalin's case, socialism in one country and moved to a arguably more nationalist direction. They could have not affected the change to socialism. And of course, because they could not rely on a arguably small proletariat to carry forth such revolution across the world, they would have to rely on a peasantry, which has a fundamentally different class interest to the proletariat, which is the main issue with the past socialist revolutions. They have only taken place in feudal or semi-feudal economies, which were definitely not ready for socialism. And the only way socialism could even really exist is if they developed through capitalism first. And that is what we actually see happening with things like the Soviet Union, except the state took a much more direct role in involving itself with industrial development rather than taking a more laissez-faire approach in the first industrialized countries like Britain and other parts of Western Europe.
Question. When somebody attempts to defend themselves by saying, oh, no, no, I'm not a communist, I'm a socialist, the question is, what's the difference? Because in practical terms, there really isn't any. They both have horrific track records with no real distinction in practice and with body counts that would make Genghis Khan blush.
Using examples of capitalism that wave a red flag and call themselves socialist is a pretty pointless argument. The whole 100 million death toll stuff is literally the most stupid idea ever, simply because you are taking death tolls or deaths that happened under capitalist rule and you are blaming them on communism, which is absolutely ridiculous.
But at least in theory, communism one day ends in a mythical wonderland of abundance where government coercion is no longer necessary because everything is owned and operated and enjoyed by the people. Socialists, on the other hand, and maybe even to their credit, don't buy that such an end state is ever possible. So they leave us with a system where government control and ultimately totalitarianism is necessary because they have to be able to centrally manage the economy. And since the economy is really nothing more than human beings engaging in transactions.
Okay, so the economy really isn't just people making transactions. I mean, what about resource distribution, for example? Like, resource distribution is like the most important aspect of economics because, if you have an economy that doesn't work for the majority, then, like, is there any point having an economy in the first place? Because the whole purpose of the economy as a human construction and invention is to supply what we need and what we want. And if we can't do that for like most of the population, then why should we even continue having such an economy when there are plenty of alternatives such as communism?
That means in order to centrally plan and control the economy, you have to centrally plan and control people.
Whoever said planning had to be central? I mean, there's plenty of decentralized alternatives, especially proposed by the more libertarian leftists out there. And there are plenty of more centralized alternatives as well. It doesn't have to follow the Soviet model. I mean, Chile, for example, they had a cybernetic feedback loop based planned economy, which arguably could have worked well if they weren't cooed by a far right dictator that privatized nearly everything.
And under socialism, that's as good as it's ever going to get. Socialism is ultimately communism, but with no fake utopia at the end.
My brother in Christ, can you shut up about accusing Marxists of advocating a utopia? We have never advocated such a thing. And any Marxists that do are not being authentic. Marxism is a materialist ideology, and that means we believe in analyzing material conditions. Stop making stuff up and making random assumptions about Marxism, please.
To even dream of. So the next time somebody tells you, no, 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 I'm not a communist, I'm a socialist, just look back at them and be like, oh, so something even worse.
You know what's actually worse? The fact that you can't read a fucking book.